in America, homes can be very female-coded places. You see the presence of things like the man cave, for example, where men are siloed away from the otherwise more curated and manicured parts of the house. But this historically isn't the case.
It's interesting to watch these trends now that are bubbling up, that the trad wife or the soft girl, or these are impulses that people are tired of feeling like they have to sort of fit in this box of a masculine kind of woman that goes to work and is ambitious and, all of the things that are sort of portrayed in the culture.
I think that we've often spoken about this in too shallow of a way, where we're reducing the differences between men and women to our functions, rather to actually like a real metaphysical reality that's embedded in us. It's quite beautiful.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Marlo Slayback. And we're joined today by Carrie Gress and Noelle Mehring, who work with the Ethics and Public Policy Center and also founded and co-wrote the book series Theology of Home. So I'm really excited to have both ladies on today because I think what we're going to discuss ultimately is how to live an integrated life, and especially one where our surroundings are reflective of our interior lives and can support its flourishing. So if you're here today and maybe you're not in a position to design a home, for example, or start a garden of your own, maybe you live in an apartment, that's okay. And I hope this conversation will go deeper than just that, and I'm sure it will. And no matter what season of life you're in, I think this will be an enriching discussion for you. So thank you both for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
And before we get to our discussion, first, I would love for the ladies to perhaps tell us a little bit about themselves. And in addition to perhaps EPPC and your work on this book, is there anything else that you'd like to kind of give us some background on?
Yeah, I guess I'll start. We wrote the book Theology of Home, finding the eternal in the everyday. How many years ago, Noelle? 5 years ago it came out, I think, roughly. And in the meantime, prior to that, we already had a blog, actually, that is called also theologyofhome.com. And, one of the things that I realized in my research, I've actually written 10 books. And one of the books that I wrote really looked at women today and a lot of the struggles that we're having with women, and why don't women, why are we losing seemingly this concept of woman? And so I realized a lot of that had to do with the fact that we weren't engaging in the culture. So much of womanhood was really being destroyed by the left through culture, through things like magazines and Hollywood and book publishing, politics, the fashion industry. And so this is sort of our very meager effort to sort of step into that. And how do we start using the ideas, conservative ideas, but putting them in the kind of context that women really love to absorb and look at, a beautiful book with incredible pictures and things to inspire us. So I would say that's really where it has come from. And we have a project at Ethics and Public Policy Center where we're really focused on this question of how do we integrate these pieces of, the home and see how these are really valuable as far as the conservative point of view. They're valuable to men, they're valuable to women, of course, to children, and focused on how do we start looking at this in a broader way instead of just through education and whatnot. So Noelle and I have also both published separate books. My books have been on feminism and her books have been more on the woke ideology, and she can tell you more about that. But we see that those are the pieces that are really working against women. At the same time, all the elements of homemaking have really come back into vogue and into fashion, but homemaking itself hasn't come back into fashion as far as that term. So in any event, we feel like we're really fighting an uphill battle to try and help people understand that these desires that we have to, bake sourdough bread or plant a garden, or to host people in our homes and enter through entertainment, these are really good fundamental things that we should be encouraging rather than discouraging in the culture.
Yeah, no, don't have much to add to that other than, just the personal background that Carrie and I met in grad school at Franciscan University Steubenville. We were both getting a master's in philosophy too many years ago to say, and then reconnected a couple of years, I think, before we started writing together. So it's nice to have that history between the two of us. My solo book is called Awake Not Woke, A Christian Response to the Cult of Progressive Ideology. And it's interesting because our work at EPPC has really it's really sort of integrated all of the things we're working on independently, but also through Theology of Home, just the idea that so much of the ideology is what is trying to pull people away from understanding any robust and important understanding of the beauty of what they're doing in their home, both for single people and also for married couples, and not just for women either, for men too. That the importance of men prioritizing their home life as well, I think, is a part of what we write about, particularly in Theology of Home 1. So it's been nice to see all of those sort of seemingly disparate pieces kind of come together through our work at EPBC, but also through our daily website, which we really make an effort to make formative, informative, and also fun and beautiful. We have a free subscription. So we have a nice email list that goes out. It kind of curates the news from things from like recipes and organizing to, spiritual stuff, to some keeping up with what's going on in the world, to, various practical aspects of daily life. So that's been a really fun project and important piece of Theology of Home too, that we've been working on together.
Great. Thank you, ladies. And before we get into our discussion, I'd like to also thank our listeners for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercalated Studies Institute, and our mission is educating for liberty. So if you'd like to join us in fulfilling this mission, please make sure to rate and review this podcast wherever you're listening to podcasts, and that'll help us reach more listeners like yourself. So I love what you're both saying about the role of homemaking in life today. And you even pointed to examples of some trends that we've seen cropping up, and I've certainly seen those as well. Actually, one of my questions was going to be about where you see if that's reflective of something greater that's happening at the more granular level, especially among the Zoomers. But I'd love to hear more first, just to unpack some of the language we're using. What does homemaking mean to you? Because it is something that can be viewed as a very loaded term. It's become the subject of a lot of, socioeconomic considerations, and women are thinking about things including vocation and career when we're having a conversation about homemaking and defining it. And I personally prefer the term vocation than career. But obviously in larger, the society at large perhaps would not use that same terminology. And obviously vocation carries less of the connotation of paid professional work. It's more linked to the domestic arts and unpaid labor, right? So how would you define homemaking, and how does that track on or map onto maybe it does, maybe doesn't, more than just, and I don't say just in a diminishing term, but more than the domestic arts that are tied to perhaps like full-time stay-at-home motherhood, which obviously is extremely edifying and noble work. But is it something that is more general than that to you?
Yeah, I'll get started. I mean, I think the main idea really is just this concept of what is a theology of home, and what's the background of that and the idea behind that. And one of the things that became really clear to me when looking at the home is that there are elements that are common to the home that are also common to a church, but we can also say them in a different kind of way about heaven. And so the real goal of a theology of home is just this recognition that the heart's desire of people is to get the ones that they love to heaven, to create an environment where people can become the best that God, people that God intended them to be. And, Noelle can talk about this probably more in depth, but I think the main vocation, as you mentioned, is really fatherhood and motherhood. And this doesn't mean that every woman is going to be a mother. We know that there are other vocations to religious life and single life and, those other elements. But what it does include is motherhood as psychological and spiritual in addition. So a mature woman in some capacity is going to mother others because she's helping to nourish people. She's helping to create a place where they can grow and become who they are. She's caring for them. She's dialed into them. There's this real richness that women have in terms of relationships that we really, are dialed into in ways that, men aren't always. And this is, I think, a gift that women have, not to say that men don't have it, but women have it in a more universal sense. So this, I think, was what motivated our writing this book, was just to sort of look at what are these elements that are common to the home. Our homes in certain respect have become almost like a hotel, where you're just, people meet up there at night. This is where you sleep. Maybe you get something to eat, but there's not really a greater depth going on that points to this idea of, parenthood, of taking care as a mother and as a father, and leading and guiding others to it. So, yeah, I think that's probably a place to start. Noelle, I'll let you add to that in terms of the mother and father piece.
Sure. Well, I'll just pick up also on, the term homemaker. I agree with you. And we talk about that, address that directly in the books, just that term has taken on such a loaded connotation. And obviously, one of the things that I think Carrie and I could both speak to is just that, motherhood, there are different seasons of motherhood. I was at home and I homeschooled for years, and now things shift and look different. And my youngest is now 11, almost 12. And I'm working a lot more and traveling and speaking. And so, but I still, it's not that now that I work, I no longer care about the home or feel that it is incumbent on me to really be prioritizing and giving special care to make this a real haven for our family and to make people feel connected and loved, and that we're not just an aggregate of people. We're a whole, almost like the home is the body that forms the family. So, I think that we make the term homemaking too specific to our detriment. I think that everyone who lives in a home and cares deeply about their family and the people in it are trying to make a home. And so I still consider myself a homemaker. And I think my husband does too. And that's an interesting thing, is that, as Carrie was indicating, all women we're distinctive insofar as we're called to be mothers in some level, psychological, spiritual, physical, but men are as well called to be fathers. And so I think we've done a disservice by kind of defining the man as his job is out in the world. The woman, if she's a stay-at-home mom, her job is in the home. Actually, the priority for both is the home life, is the family. And that the job is for the sake of the people he's coming back to, if he's, more in the traditional role of going out and working. And I think that's part of the things or one of the things that was particularly interesting to write about in Theology of Home. It's just, what does this mean for men? And my husband, he would come home from work and he would say, okay, now this is where the crux of my day begins. I'm not here to now relax from the real work of my day, but now I'm here to actually bring my best self and engage the most deeply with the people who matter the most. So that was a beautiful part of writing it too.
Yeah, I love that. And that's something I've been thinking a lot about. And I highly recommend to our listeners, and I'm sure you both are familiar with Mary Harrington and some of her work on, especially kind of, there seems to be a lack of historical sensibility, I think, when we talk about homemaking and what it has meant, especially in American life. I think a lot of people tend to, it evokes almost this caricature of the 1950s housewife who is, doing a lot of the domestic economy of the household was very confined to a suburban home where the husband's work was, at an office. Whereas you think in the bigger picture, everyone was working, on the farm or whatever. It was more of a subsistence situation where the work wasn't outsourced to it wasn't, out in the city or beyond the parameters of the house and the property. It was women, children, and fathers, and it was mothers and fathers who were working within those parameters. And so I think that that's been an interesting distinction, and a good one, I think, that I've seen Mary make, especially on social media, that has kind of, I think, cultivated a better historical sensibility about what that work has looked like. And men's role, especially in homemaking, your book is accessible, but it is targeted towards women, which I love. And especially I think in America, homes can be very female coded places. Like you see the presence of things like the man cave, for example, where men are kind of siloed away from the otherwise more curated and manicured parts of the house. But this historically isn't the case. And I was actually talking to Erica Bakioki the other week, and I know you ladies know her because she's mentioned both of you. But she was even telling me that homes couldn't have ever operated this way before a certain period in American history, because when men came home from working on the farm or elsewhere, they may have had very dirty boots, and they, needed a place that would accept them and have the leisure time and comfort in his own home without, totally upsetting the harmony and the cleanliness. So that's a long way of asking, how do you think men participate in the economy of the domestic household when it comes to things like, if I guess, where does the distinction between a a woman's vocation and her responsibilities for child rearing and the things that she's specialized to do. Like my husband loves to say that he sometimes has the realization that he's like, wow, Marlo, like I couldn't do a third of the things that, or like, 90% of the things that you do for our kids, for our son, because that's just by virtue of you being a woman. And that's, I think, a realization that we've departed from as we try to we starting to view women as not being specialized, as being able to do everything that men can do. Obviously, to a degree, regarding careers, there are certainly parallels, but biology does not. Obviously, there are things that we can't depart from. So how would you view, in light of that and some of the different obviously after the sexual revolution, things have changed there. What would you respond to those gendered questions, I guess?
Noelle, I'll let you go ahead and start on this one.
Yeah, no, well, something Carrie and I talk a lot about is just that there's a lot of ways in which the beauty of being a woman has been presented as something that's sort of weak. And so, which part of what I think we both try to do through the Theology of Home project is to actually remember the beauty of those more womanly traits, that, as you say, there's a lot of things that we can do that men can't just by virtue of being mothers and, nursing the baby and bearing the baby and holding the baby. And sometimes even we're better at comforting the baby, when they're really little. But that, I think what we forget is also that there's a great there's a lot of power in that, but there's also a lot of vulnerability, that I think about being postpartum, and my husband closing the doors because he figured, oh, maybe she'll grab a nap if I shut the door and take the kids out away from her. And, and realizing just in those small little details of family life that I really needed that, I really needed him to kind of be aware and plugged in enough that he could see, okay, Noelle is, pretty vulnerable right now. And she's, physically weak and she's, emotionally kind of very raw. And just recognizing that vulnerability and saying, okay, as the husband, as the man, I'm going to sort of protect that and let her nurture what she's got going on with the baby and also healing and all these things. And it's a really beautiful ballet, that kind of way in which men and women are, I think, really ordained and made to sort of work together. It's not necessarily I think people get so hung up on sort of really rigid roles, that only women do this and only men do that. And Carrie actually writes beautifully too about this, just the idea that, what we are is primary, and so it's more about who I am as a woman. And then from that flows oftentimes an inclination to certain activities. But, I think that we've often spoken about this in too shallow of a way, where we're reducing the differences between men and women to our functions rather to actually like a real metaphysical reality that's embedded in us. It's quite beautiful.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think, as Noelle mentioned, we have this shallow sense. And I think some of that comes from the sexual revolution. It comes from feminism in the sense of asking the question, how do we make women more like men? And we see this sort of in the girl boss mentality. And, it's interesting to watch these trends now that are bubbling up, that the trad wife or the soft girl or whatever. But I think, these are impulses that people are tired of feeling like they have to sort of fit in this box of a masculine kind of woman that goes to work and is ambitious and, all of the things that are sort of portrayed in the culture, instead of really recognizing that, there's a different way to be. And, I think this is where the left has been so incredibly successful in their messaging, is just this idea of, what does a successful woman look like? It's all the things that they're embodying, again, through media and whatnot. And what does the opposite woman look like? She's a doormat. She's wearing a red bonnet with a red robe and a fertility cult. They have very much boxed us into thinking that this is how we need to live our lives as women if we're not going to be with them. It's sort of this binary, these binary concepts, which of course the human mind loves these binary concepts. We like one extreme or the other. And this is why they've been able to sort of paint us into this corner instead of having a much more rich and robust understanding of really what a mother is and what she does. And I think that when we give it any kind of real thought, just how important our own mothers are in our lives and in our development. Even the real tragedy that happens when you see a woman with young children pass away. There are fewer things that are more tear jerking than that kind of dynamic where small children are left without their mother. And how do you explain that to a small child? And just that, it's gut wrenching. So I think that these are, like Noelle said, I think these are things that we need to come back to and revisit as conservatives and just say, we're not looking at this properly. We need to see this in a way that's healthy, ordered, and beautiful, where there's really flourishing again among a couple, to not necessarily like fit into these boxes of what it is that we're doing, but how it is that we as a unique couple with different gifts and attributes work together to make a family healthy and ordered and beautiful.
And do you see any hope in, especially among, I'm just thinking of something that a lot of friends of mine have been commenting on, is the popularity of TikTok accounts. And you mentioned kind of these like pigeonholed caricatures of, the trad wife. But I've been seeing, and you mentioned a few of the different, like the soft girl examples like that, but the popularity of these TikTok accounts that are, obviously Zoomers are, TikTok is like their Twitter, their Facebook, and these accounts are showing women living very, bucolic lives on their farm or otherwise very aesthetically rustic and beautiful settings and homes, and they have, maybe several kids, maybe they're baking and playing and doing other, mom activities, traditionally very, female coded mother, maternal activities with their children. And one example comes to mind is Ballerina Farm. I think that's probably one of the bigger accounts that has gained a lot of, I think, traction and followers. But it is appealing, right? They're living very beautiful lives. And you can argue that, sure, it may be cushioned with wealth and other forms of, like income that support that sort of lifestyle. But that doesn't really matter to, I think, the Gen Z, 20 something who's looking at it and saying like, wow, I want that. Like, I don't want the alternative, even if that is coming from a place of that polarization that is so ingrained in our heads. There is something that isn't instinctively or reflexively off-putting about that lifestyle, it seems, anymore. Whereas perhaps several years ago, we'd look at that and maybe say like, sure, it's pretty, but it's also like oppressive, or I would feel so boxed in if I had that sort of life at home with my children. So do you see anything happening there, or is this just a trend that's limited and not as wide-reaching in scope?
Yeah. Well, Carrie, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I would just say, one of the things that Noelle and I were really purposeful in doing in our second book, Theology of Home, The Spiritual Art of Homemaking, was really focusing on this idea of how do we come up with a new grammar to speak about women? Because again, we've had this model of either you're a doormat or you're the successful career woman. And women just don't really understand how to live in a functioning, healthy way. We don't even have the goal of what is a good woman anymore. I think nobody really asked that question. It's not at the forefront of our minds. And so I think that's was one of the things that we've really focused on, is trying to give women a way to think about that from very tangible examples. So I think that one of the things that's happening with this is really heartening, because it's first of all, it's questioning the status quo, which, I know I grew up very much with a sense of how a woman ought to be. And I think that this is a really healthy thing, because it's starting to show that motherhood isn't just drudgery. And this is, something that I've chronicled from around the turn of the century in the 1900s. This was really the popular way of speaking about motherhood, was in these terms of drudgery, of, our fertility being a weight that we had to be freed from, those kinds of things. So I think it's, it's really interesting to see sort of this pushback and just a real way of representing life. Now, of course, there's a lot of things that are aspirational, but I think that this is what the left has done with the career as well. There were a lot of things that were aspirational about all the sitcoms that we watched, and were shown sort of these ideal lives of women like Murphy Brown and whatnot. So in any event, I think it's really encouraging. And obviously I'll let Noelle chime in too, but I'm seeing it as in a positive way, as far as just giving our imaginations a way to think about things differently than what we have been given by kind of elite women in the culture.
Yeah, no, I was going to say something similar, just that, I think that we are so used to seeing aspirational lifestyles portrayed on one side of the pendulum, and then when it swings to the other side, somehow people get really bothered by that. But, this is just something that happens with cultural movements. I think it's just natural that there's going to be things that are maybe presenting, a more glossy version of something that they're trying to move the culture toward, and then there's going to be things that are more substantive and maybe more authentic and maybe more honest, and feel a little bit more real for people who want to resonate with something that is less aspirational. So and I actually think that we really strived in Theology of Home to sort of walk both lines. Like, we really want to present the beauty, and so the books, one of the comments we get a lot is just that they're just really beautiful. They're just fun to look at because they are so appealing. They really draw you in. And sometimes people say, well, I wish that there was, more, messy homes or something like that. And Carrie and I often just respond, well, when I look at any magazine, I don't necessarily want to look at a messy home. I want to look at something that's inspiring to me and something that's beautiful. And it's not to make me feel bad. It's to help to stir something creative in me and something that longs for that sort of beauty and order. At the same time, we're very different from all those magazines because we have pregnant women and a bunch of children running around and fathers who are engaged, and there's a lot more life in it. So I think we've walked that line in a way that the home is not a showpiece. It's rather, a place that serves the people that are in it. And that there's a real human element to it. I think that has been very important to both of us. And in that way, I think it does bring that more real authenticity to it. So that's been important to do, I think, just because of all of these sort of cultural things happening with, what's the message we're giving? People want authenticity, but people also want to be inspired. And, we have to walk all of that in a way that feels really honest and really, but still prioritizes beauty, because beauty's honest too. The soul longs for it. And so we need to feed that and recognize that as well.
I love your comment about the messy home, because something that I think, and I think this is a good point to talk about the more like concrete details of like interior design, because I think with a lot of the more like contemporary styles, it's very hard to have a messy home. When your entire, like, the color scheme of your house is largely whites and grays, a child's like crazy, crayon, like their paintings, their like my son has these blocks that are this really, really bright, his Legos are like red and green and blue and so many different colors. And that would stick out in a house that was, made of, and I've been in beautiful big houses where it's just white and black and gray. And it's really, really hard to maintain a home that is messy because it just sticks out like a sore thumb. Whereas, a design style that I really love and that I think is just so humane and civilized, while being able to like have that give and flexibility to the ebb and flow and the like cadence of just life with children, life with hobbies and animals, and and bringing the outdoors in, whether that means through hunting, is like English countryside. And I specifically bring that style up because I was looking at a picture of Roger Scruton's study the other day, or the other week, and it occurred to me while kind of like studying the study, is that like you look at his table and there was clutter everywhere, but it didn't stick out as like mess. It didn't stick out as like this, just total chaos or anarchy. There was a harmony in the home. And it's a very traditional style, but it has really honest elements, like wood, color, texture, pattern. Not everything was heavily curated. There was no grayish in sight. And it occurred to me how different, how polar opposite from our current, I think there's a lot of emphasis on cleanliness and tidiness, and just not even from, cleaning up after ourselves, but the style itself is like, I don't mean to like pick on Kim Kardashian's house, but her house is like, just minimalist, the most minimal of the minimalist, right? It's like, how do people live in that? How do children, live in that without needing constant attention to pick up after them? So, just from the more concrete side of things, how do you think about interior design trends and how parents who maybe, mothers who don't have time to maybe like study an interior design book or like any, magazines to see like what's hot right now? What is the like what is organic to you and what elements of a home make it a suitable place for children to live, for men, for husbands to live without feeling like they need to be siloed in their man cave downstairs. And you could even, I would love to hear about, if there are certain trends or if this is something that cannot be boxed into like a type of design.
Yeah, no, I mean, I historically have been attracted to minimalism just because it just seems so peaceful, but I've realized that, that it's not practical for family life, as you've said. And I do think there's something, a trend in culture towards minimalism that reflects sort of this general like trend towards becoming like machines in a way. There's something really antiseptic about it, something very controlled about it, but there's not much that's very human about it. And as you say, juxtaposing that with the English countryside, there's something incredibly human about thinking about Roger Scruton's office with these real materials that are not necessarily, I imagine, lots of wood and books and old, and not a lot of plastic. But, obviously with a bunch of children, there's plastics going to come into your life. But I think, just restoring the integrity of, there's a movement with a lot of families to sort of more Montessori type materials and things that have more integrity in how they're crafted. And then your mess seems a little bit more beautiful, I think. That's not necessarily practical for everyone, but as far as trends go, I think that it trends in some ways as sort of a manipulation just to get us to spend more money. And, it's sort of like when you try to dress in ways that are trendy, but they don't work for you. You at some point in your womanhood, you realize, oh, I can't, that silhouette will never look flattering on me. I need to become mature enough to understand what actually works on me. And I think our homes are sort of similar to that. There was a phase in the 90s where everyone tried to turn their home into a Tuscan villa, with all the browns and then, the tiles and really ornate granite and all this stuff. And I think a lot of people regretted that because they were trying to force their home to something that it's not. If you're living in a 1960s tract home, it's never going to look like a Tuscan villa, no matter how much money you pour into it. So I do think it's better to try to steer clear of trends and try to focus more on things that have historical and ancestral meaning to you. If there are hand-me-downs from your family, from your parents. One of the most beautiful homes I've been in was a family of 10 and they had very modest means, but she put a lot of order into things and she bought things in bulk. And so she had big canisters for all of her bulk nuts and her bulk flour and her bulk oils. And they were carefully laid out in order. And then she had framed children's artwork because she wasn't necessarily going out and buying artwork. And there was so much love put into the home that I think we forget that oftentimes what makes a home most beautiful is just that somebody is caring about the way it looks and putting the order and the love into it. That's not necessarily reflective of luxury, but is reflective of real beauty, real human beauty and love.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with all of that in the sense that we in Theology of Home 1, we actually talk about sort of the elements that go into the home, these transcendentals that I mentioned earlier that we sort of see on par with the church and also with heaven. And one of those is absolutely order. And I think order is something that it can obviously feel very elusive, especially when you have small children. But it doesn't really take very much as a few bins to slide something in the corner, or even teaching your children the art of cleaning up after themselves. I mean, this is much easier said than done. I have 5 children. The youngest is 3 and can be very, very challenging. So I think it's that balance of like trying to make things, systematize them in such a way that it's easy to keep order, but at the same time, obviously balancing that out with the humanity that you're dealing with and all this pressures and strains, especially when your children are very small, and trying to balance that out in a healthy way. But these transcendentals, I think, can be applied to almost any kind of home. And that's obviously order. Like I mentioned, I think light is really important. Things like lamps and the right kind of light bulbs, and these kinds of things can go a long way. Different window dressings, all of that. So it seems really important things to think about that doesn't have to be incredibly expensive either. And then, of course, there's, other basic things that need to be in a home, things like comfort and safety. Hospitality is another one that we talk a lot about in the book. Our homes a place where people feel welcome when they come into them? And, that's for years, we did not entertain because I just didn't feel like our house is a place where we could welcome people because it was that struggle of dealing with so many children at young ages. But that's again what, like Noelle mentioned previously, we have these different seasons of life, and those are important to be responsive to. And I think hospitality is just one of those elements that it doesn't have to be something luxurious, and making that distinction between what feels luxurious and what's beautiful. Luxurious is something that is pleasurable for us, but beauty is something that calls us out of ourselves. And I think I've had people have dinner with us, and we every Saturday night we do this set of prayers, a reflection of sort of Lord's Day prayers, and what we call them, different psalms and readings, and we light candles, and it's just a really beautiful family event. And we sort of take it for granted because we do it all the time. But when you have people from the outside come into it, there's something very simple and beautiful about having a whole family, orienting themselves to God on a Saturday evening. So it's those kinds of things that I think that, it's less about the brick and mortar and the fabrics and whatnot. It's a lot more about, like Noelle said, the love that goes into it and what it is that how we're using our gifts to engage those in our family, and of course, those from the outside world that are coming into our homes as well.
And how would you say the the physical items that you put in your home, but also obviously these different traditions, these different habits that you build within its walls, how would you say and maybe this is, this is obviously kind of reflected in your book, but what about these aspects of homemaking do you think are things that legitimately you see reflected in your own, whether it's your own children, or perhaps this can be more a general commentary on how children are raised? So something, just an example for how me and my husband have approached. It's funny because there's this like funny idea that people who work in tech end up being the ones who send their kids to Montessori schools and saying like no technology in the home. That's kind of us. My husband works in tech, and we don't have a TV in our home because and my son watches TV like at his grandparents. It's just very limited, and we are very strict about what he watches. But at home, the TV almost takes up all the oxygen in the room because it's almost like the center ornament, at least in our house, because just of how it's structured. So we don't have one. And it occurred to me when we sit down to have conversation and, our son is playing, there's not this, the energy isn't all, and the way we even position our bodies isn't towards the television like it is perhaps at our parents' house, at my parents' house. That's just one example, but it also made me feel a little bit better about, that's just one piece of the larger kind of picture of the things that I bring into the home, whether it's, iconography or, it's a beautiful painting made with like oils and nice colors that aren't, like mass produced paintings that you would just like pick up that look, the Tuscan Villa one. I love, that's something I've been thinking a lot about because I see the same paintings in everyone's home that, maybe were picked up at a, big box store or something in the early 2000s. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you're comfortable in your home, then I'm happy for you. So no judgment. But in my own home, I know so many moms who love your book, and they do a lot of their shopping at like thrift stores and Goodwills and other, secondhand stores, and they find like really stunning pieces with beautiful frames and colors. And it seems like that sort of approach to homemaking is and I still have to see the effects. My son is only a toddler, but it almost seems like children are able to almost develop a creativity of their own and a appreciation and different type of taste for culture and the particularity of the place they live when that's their surroundings. So I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on how there is that influence in the place that we live on young children and the family.
Sure. Yeah.
Noelle?
I mean, I remember when I was a younger mom and the kids were little, there was this huge trend of TV shows of taking a diamond in the rough and putting a left sweat equity into it and making it something really special and beautiful and unique. And I think there's an element of home decorating that is sort of similar to the TikTok videos you're talking about earlier, that people just need to start, particularly when we're younger, just experimenting with things and just trying it out, and I love that sense of the creativity that's born out of sort of need, right? So we didn't have a budget really for decorating. So I remember finding things on Craigslist and at thrift stores and painting them and trying to sand them down and try to make something beautiful. And the kids were just along for the ride because they were always with me. And so they would get into the action too. And I think there's some sort of pride that goes into seeing that we're all in it as a team, sort of trying to improve this common project, which is our home and family life. That is really beautiful. And I think that's important for women to feel that sort of freedom rather than getting intimidated by, the call to have a perfect home or a beautiful home, that we can actually just kind of get our hands dirty and just throw things up against the wall and try it out and see what works. And then in that experimentation, if we treat it as something fun with sort of a sporting spirit, then our kids sort of see it as something fun too, and something that they can just jump into life, whatever their interests are, and just start trying things. I think that's a really beautiful lesson to communicate to kids, and for them to see that their mom is sort of leading the way in that. I think is a neat thing for them to see as well. That it's not something that has to be anxiety ridden or about performance, or as Carrie said, we talk about the distinction between luxury and beauty. Luxury serves me, beauty points us outward, and that if we are hung up on perfectionism, then we lose what is actually beautiful about this project of home. So part of that is being human and having errors and having weaknesses and having foibles and then beginning again and all of those beautiful, very human things. So I think there's a lot in trying to set up our home that mirrors that.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with all that. I think, the interesting thing about Noelle and I, our relationship, is she is so much more gifted at design than I am. I know what I like when I see it, but I don't know how to make things look good. And so it's always sort of, she and I have this challenge, because we also have an online store. And so this question of, what we put in our homes and what we're going to sell on our store, which supports a significant amount of our work, is really interesting because we try to find things that we feel like people will, they'll be unique, that they can be good gifts to give to people, that they can be meaningful and made with beautiful materials, woods and metals and good waxes and all of those kinds of things. So that's something that I feel like I spend a lot of my time thinking about. What would be a great gift? And the nice thing is that I'm pretty much our customer. Like I think a lot of people that are buying because I'm very much like them. But I wouldn't say that I'm great at decorating my home. I think I can sort of pull things together, but it's not some sort of overwhelmingly beautiful thing that people are sort of awestruck by. I just don't have those gifts. So for me, it comes down to just what are some of the basics? How do we keep things organized? How do we keep our space from feeling like it's just overrun by kid stuff? It's a very practical thing that I think, even if you just do that, your home is going to feel richer and more welcoming because you're not going to be battling all the stuff, decluttering. I have a sister who's just incredible about decluttering. And there are certain days when I'm like, I just need to act like Jill right now and get rid of some of this stuff because I'll just feel guilty about it otherwise and hang on to it. So that it's, for me, it's more about just clearing out, and there's so much comes in with 5 kids, but trying to hang on to the very special things that my children made when they were small and are that are important to them. But at the same time, also, balancing that out with our real life and the limitations of the size of our home and, all of those kinds of things. So I think I tend to be much more practical about this and instead of, being in a place where it's something that I really want to carve out a budget for and whatnot. So, I think it's going to look different for each woman and for where her priorities are and how she wants to spend her time too.
Well, thank you ladies so much. This has been a wonderful chat, and I'm so glad we've been able to talk about your book, your books, plural, And I'd love to have our audience members know a little bit more about the offerings that you have, because I know it's not just Theology of Home 1, it's Theology of Home 2 as well. And then I believe you have additional books on top of that. So if there's more of your work that you'd like to plug and maybe giving us a rundown of all of the Theology of Home series, we'll plug them in the show notes for listeners to be able to, go to and purchase. And then anything else that you two are working on that you would like to let our listeners know about.
Yeah, so we have the first two Theology of Homes, and then we did Theology of Home 3, which is At the Sea. And that was really fun to photograph. We were out in my family went out to California to be with Noelle's family. And, it was just all those things about the sea and water and the ways in which our lives can really be formed by them, and the joy that it can bring through water. And then the fourth one was actually not written by us. It was written by our colleague, Emily Malloy, who's just this amazing woman. It's called it's Theology of Home, Arranging the Seasons. And it's basically about flowers. It's, goes from January through to December and talks about the different seasons of growth and dormancy and all of those kinds of things that happen throughout the year. But Emily's really special in the fact that she did all the photography for this book. She wrote the book. She grew all the flowers for this book. She arranged the flowers for this book. I mean, she's just this incredible dynamo. She's also an incredible baker, and she does a lot of recipes for us over at Theology of Home and writes all kinds of beautiful things. So we're now out to four books for Theology of Home, and a lot of these have made their way. I know the first one has been translated into Chinese and Lithuanian. We've got all kinds of requests from in Polish and French and Spanish. So those keep rolling out. And then I've written the book. My most recent book is called The End of Woman: How Smashing the Patriarchy Has Destroyed Us, and that came out in August. So I've been spending a lot of time plugging that book and working on those aspects. And I think that's kind of all that I've been up to. It's been a lot. And of course, running our store, which is always really fun. And we made it through another great Christmas, and it's just fun to start thinking about what it is that we can help women with in their homes and gift giving and ways in which they can improve their lives through these very simple things, but that I think can be significant in their homes.
Yeah, and I would just also encourage people at our website, theologyofhome.com. It's a great way to stay in touch with us. We do put our personal writings on there when those come out, as well as our interviews and shows. And but it's we hear from women all the time that they wake up in the morning, they get a cup of coffee, and they open up the daily collection email, and then they scroll through and see what they can read today, what can be inspirational and what can be practical. And and oftentimes they no longer have to surf the web to stay up to date in the world, that we've sort of curated that for them in a way that is filtering out stuff that has kind of ideology in it or junk in it or things that are offensive to their views and values. So it's also just a good way, I think, in general, to stay informed.
Well, thank you both so much again for joining us. And I hope you all will take a look at the many different books and the content that Carrie and Noelle have just told us about, which will be in the show notes, like I mentioned. And thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please head over to our website at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, debates, lectures, and of course this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we'll see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.